What happens when one of Hollywood's biggest legends walks onto a talk show and things spiral completely out of control? What you're about to hear is a conversation that went from charming to controversial in a matter of minutes, ending with security being called and a guest being escorted off set. Before we get into this unbelievable exchange, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me what you think went wrong here. Now, let's dive into what actually happened on Kelly Clarkson's show that had everyone talking. The show started like any other episode. Kelly Clarkson, known for her warm personality and ability to make any guest feel comfortable, welcomed Michael Douglas to the stage with her signature enthusiasm. The audience applauded as Douglas made his way to the guest chair, waving and smiling. Kelly greeted him with a hug, and they both settled into their seats. "Michael Douglas, welcome to the show," Kelly said, beaming at her guest. "I have to say, I've been such a fan of your work for years. Thank you so much for being here." "Thank you for having me," Kelly, Douglas replied, his voice carrying that distinctive gravitas he's known for. "I've heard wonderful things about your show." Kelly laughed and leaned forward slightly. "Well, I hope we live up to the hype. So, I want to start by talking about your incredible career. You've been in this industry for decades, and you've seen it change so much. What do you think is the biggest difference between Hollywood then and Hollywood now?" Douglas paused, and something shifted in his expression. "You know, Kelly, that's an interesting question. But I think the real question is whether those changes have been for the better or not." Kelly nodded, seemingly expecting a thoughtful reflection. "Right. Of course. I mean, there's been a lot of progress in some areas." "Progress," Douglas repeated, his tone becoming slightly sharper. "That's a word people use a lot these days. But sometimes I wonder if we've confused progress with something else entirely." There was a brief, uncomfortable silence. Kelly's smile remained, but her eyes showed a flicker of uncertainty. "What do you mean by that?" Douglas leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs. "I mean that we've created an environment where everyone is terrified to say what they really think. Everything is filtered through this lens of what's acceptable, what's politically correct, what won't get you canceled, and I think that's killed authenticity in storytelling." Kelly's expression became more guarded. "I think people are just being more conscious of how their words affect others, Michael. That's not necessarily a bad thing." "Conscious," Douglas said, nodding slowly. "Or controlled. There's a difference, Kelly. When I started in this business, artists took risks. They challenged audiences. They made people uncomfortable because that's what great art does. Now everyone's just trying not to offend anyone, and we're producing the most sanitized, safe content imaginable." The audience had gone quiet. Kelly shifted in her seat, clearly trying to navigate the conversation back to safer territory. "But don't you think some of those risks came at the expense of marginalized communities? I mean, we can look back at some older films and see things that are pretty problematic by today's standards." Douglas's jaw tightened. Problematic. Another one of those words. Everything's problematic now. You can't make a joke. You can't explore complex themes. You can't create a flawed character without someone writing a think piece about why it's damaging. Kelly's voice remained calm. But there was an edge to it now. "With respect, Michael, I don't think asking for more inclusive and thoughtful storytelling is the same as censorship. It's about recognizing that media has power. And with that power comes responsibility." "Responsibility to who?" Douglas shot back. "To the loudest voices on social media, to people who've decided they're the moral arbiters of what everyone else should think and feel." Kelly took a breath, her professional composure being tested. "To the people who've been historically excluded or misrepresented, is it really so much to ask that we think about how our work impacts others?" Douglas leaned forward, his voice rising slightly. "Impact. Everything's about impact now. What about intent? What about context? What about the fact that art is supposed to reflect reality? And reality is messy and complicated and not always pleasant. Art can reflect reality without perpetuating harmful stereotypes," Kelly countered, her voice steady but firm. "And I think most people in the industry understand that now." "Most people in the industry are afraid," Douglas said, his words coming faster now. "They're afraid of losing work, afraid of being labeled, afraid of one wrong word ending their career. That's not an environment that produces great art. That's an environment that produces mediocrity." Kelly's expression hardened. "I think what you're calling mediocrity, a lot of people would call progress. We're telling more diverse stories, giving platforms to voices that have been silenced for decades. That matters. Does it?" Douglas asked, his tone challenging. "Or are we just checking boxes?" Diversity for diversity's sake, without any real thought to whether we're actually saying anything meaningful. The tension in the studio was palpable now. Kelly's hands gripped the armrests of her chair. I think you're oversimplifying a very complex conversation, Michael. And honestly, I'm a little surprised by your perspective on this. Douglas's eyes narrowed. Why? Because I'm supposed to just nod along and agree with whatever the current narrative is. That's exactly my point, Kelly. We can't even have honest disagreements anymore without someone being shocked or offended. Kelly's voice remained controlled, but barely. There's a difference between honest disagreement and dismissing legitimate concerns about representation and inclusion. And right now, it sounds a lot more like the latter. Legitimate according to who? Douglas pressed. You, the people on Twitter, a handful of activists who've decided they speak for everyone. Kelly stood up, something no one expected. Michael, I think we need to take a different direction with this conversation. This is not what I want my show to be about. Douglas remained seated, looking up at her with an expression that mixed defiance and disbelief. Of course you do, because actually discussing these things is too uncomfortable. It's easier to just shut down the conversation, isn't it? Kelly's voice was firm now, the warmth completely gone. This isn't about shutting down conversation. This is about not using my platform to dismiss the very real experiences and concerns of people who've been fighting for a place in this industry. Douglas stood up as well, facing her across the small space between them. Your platform. That's interesting because last I checked I was invited here as a guest. I didn't realize that meant I had to parrot your opinions back to you. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to react or how. Kelly's professional mask was slipping, revealing genuine anger underneath. You were invited here for a conversation, Michael. Not a lecture on why you think the industry's efforts toward inclusivity are somehow ruining entertainment. That's not what I said, Douglas replied, his voice tight. But you're so caught up in your own righteousness that you can't even hear what I'm actually saying. Kelly pointed toward the wings of the stage, her hand trembling slightly. I think this interview is over. Douglas didn't move. He stood there staring at Kelly with an expression that seemed to challenge everything about the situation. You're really going to do this? You're going to throw me off your show because we disagree? Kelly's arm remained extended, pointing off stage. I'm ending this interview because this has stopped being a respectful conversation. You're a guest on my show, and I'm not going to let you use this space to belittle the progress people have worked so hard for. Belittle, Douglas repeated, shaking his head. You're so determined to be offended that you're not even listening. I never said progress was bad. I said we've lost something in the process. But nuance doesn't exist anymore, does it? You're either completely on board with everything, or you're the enemy. Kelly's voice rose, something rare for her. That's not fair, Michael. You came on here and dismissed concerns about representation as people being too sensitive. You suggested that caring about how our work affects others is somehow killing creativity. Those aren't nuanced takes. Those are dismissive ones. They're honest ones, Douglas fired back. But I guess honesty isn't valued as much as conformity these days. You want me to sit here and tell you everything is perfect? That there are no downsides to any of these changes? That anyone who has any reservations is just some out-of-touch dinosaur? Kelly stepped closer, her eyes blazing. What I want is for you to recognize that your perspective comes from a place of privilege. You've had opportunities in this industry that countless talented people were denied because of their gender, their race, their background. So, forgive me if I don't have a lot of sympathy for your complaints about having to be more thoughtful. Douglas's face flushed. Privilege. There it is. That's the word that ends every conversation, isn't it? Just dismiss everything someone says because of their privilege. Never mind that I've worked my entire life. Never mind the struggles I've had. None of that matters because I checked the wrong boxes for you. That's not what I said, Kelly shot back, her voice sharp. Don't twist my words, Michael. I'm not dismissing your career or your work. I'm asking you to consider perspectives beyond your own. To understand why people might celebrate changes that make the industry more accessible and fair. Douglas laughed. But there was no humor in it. More fair. Is it fair that actors are now afraid to take certain roles because they might not be the right ethnicity? Is it fair that writers have to include diversity consultants to make sure they don't accidentally offend someone? Is it fair that one misstep, one poorly worded comment can end someone's career? Kelly's hands were shaking now. Her composure barely held together. You're comparing accountability to oppression, and they're not the same thing. Yes, people face consequences for their actions. Now, that's not persecution. That's progress. Consequences decided by who? Douglas demanded. There's no trial, no due process, just a mob on social media deciding someone's guilty and demanding their head. And you call that justice? Kelly's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. I call it people finally having a voice. I call it marginalized communities finally being able to push back against systems that excluded them for decades. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, including you, then maybe that discomfort is necessary. Douglas took a step toward her, his voice intense. You think you're on the right side of history, don't you? You think you're fighting the good fight, but all you're doing is creating a new kind of intolerance, one where everyone has to think the same way, believe the same things, or they're cast out. Kelly stood her ground. I think I'm on the side of basic human decency. I think I'm on the side of giving everyone a fair shot. And if you see that as intolerance, then I don't know what to tell you, Michael. Basic human decency, Douglas echoed. That's a nice shield to hide behind, but what you're really doing is enforcing conformity. Everyone has to publicly support every cause, every movement, every initiative, or they're labeled as bigots. That's not decency, Kelly. That's authoritarianism with a friendly face. The audience had begun to murmur, some appearing uncomfortable, others seeming engaged by the raw confrontation unfolding before them. Kelly heard the noise and seemed to remember where she was. You know what, Michael? I've given you plenty of space to share your views. You've made your position clear, and I've made mine clear. This conversation isn't going anywhere productive. Douglas's voice was cold now. Productive meaning I agree with you. That's the only acceptable outcome here, isn't it? Kelly turned toward the wings again. I need security, please. The words hung in the air like a bomb. Douglas's eyes widened, genuine shock crossing his face. Security? You're calling security on me? For what? Having a different opinion than you? Kelly faced him again, her jaw set. For refusing to leave when I've ended the interview. For turning my show into a platform for views that I fundamentally disagree with. For being disrespectful. Disrespectful? Douglas said, his voice rising to match hers. I've been disrespectful. You've called me privileged, dismissed everything I've said, accused me of not caring about people. But I'm the disrespectful one. Kelly's voice shook with emotion. Yes, Michael. Because at the end of the day, you're sitting here complaining about having to be more considerate while other people are just fighting to exist in this industry, to be seen, to be heard, to get opportunities. Your complaints ring hollow compared to that. Douglas's face was red now, his famous composure completely gone. You have no idea what you're talking about. You sit here in your bubble surrounded by people who tell you you're right about everything, and you think you understand the world, but you don't. You understand your version of it. The sanitized, approved version where everyone agrees and no one challenges anything. Kelly's voice was steel. I understand enough to know that this conversation is over. Security should be here any moment. Douglas looked around, seeming to notice the cameras for the first time in minutes. You're really going to do this? You're going to have me escorted out of here like some kind of criminal? And you think that makes you look good? Kelly didn't flinch. I think it makes it clear that I won't tolerate what this has become. You were invited here as a guest, Michael. Guests don't get to hijack the show for their own agenda. My agenda? Douglas said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. My agenda of having an actual conversation instead of just nodding along. What a terrible crime. 2 security personnel appeared from the wings, looking uncertain about the situation they were walking into. Kelly gestured toward Douglas. Please escort Mr. Douglas from the studio. Douglas looked at the security guards, then back at Kelly. This is unbelievable. You realize what this looks like, right? You realize how this appears. Kelly's voice was quiet but firm. It looks like someone who refused to respect my show and my audience. That's what it looks like. The security guard stood awkwardly between Kelly and Douglas, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. One of them, a tall man with graying hair, spoke quietly. Mr. Douglas, if you could please come with us. Douglas held up his hand. Give me a minute, please. He turned back to Kelly, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. The anger was still there, but underneath it was something else. Disappointment, maybe. You know what the saddest part of all this is, Kelly? We're not even that far apart. If we actually listened to each other instead of performing for an audience, we'd probably find common ground. But that's not how things work anymore. Kelly's expression didn't soften. Common ground requires mutual respect, Michael. And you've shown none of that today. Douglas's laugh was bitter. I've shown no respect. I came here to have a conversation, a real one, Not a scripted exchange where I tell heartwarming anecdotes and plug my latest project. I thought you of all people would appreciate that. You've built your reputation on being genuine, on being real. Being real doesn't mean being cruel, Kelly replied. It doesn't mean dismissing other people's experiences because they don't align with your worldview. Douglas shook his head slowly. You keep saying I'm dismissing people, but what you're doing is dismissing me. Every point I've made, you've reduced to some kind of moral failing on my part. You've decided I'm the villain in this story, and nothing I say will change that. Kelly crossed her arms. You made yourself the villain, Michael. The moment you started complaining about having to be thoughtful about representation, about having to consider how your work affects people, those complaints reveal everything about your priorities. My priorities, Douglas said, his voice tired now. My priorities are making meaningful art, creating stories that move people, that challenge them, that make them think. But you've reduced that to me not caring about anyone but myself. Kelly's voice remained firm. Because that's what it sounds like when you say that caring about inclusion and representation is killing creativity. That's what you're saying, that your creative freedom matters more than other people's dignity. Douglas looked at her for a long moment. You really believe that, don't you? You really think that's what I'm saying? What else should I think? Kelly asked. You've spent the last several minutes arguing against the very things that have made this industry better for so many people. What other conclusion is there? Douglas turned slightly toward the audience. Then back to Kelly. Then the conclusion that maybe, just maybe, we can want the same things but have different concerns about how we get there. That maybe we can support diversity and inclusion while also worrying about creative freedom and honest expression. That maybe the world isn't as simple as good guys and bad guys. Kelly's jaw tightened. That sounds nice, Michael, but in practice, what you're advocating for is going back to a time when people like me, people from backgrounds different than yours, had to fight twice as hard for half the recognition, and I won't apologize for not being sympathetic to that. Douglas's shoulders sagged slightly. I'm not asking you to apologize. I'm asking you to understand that change always comes with trade-offs. That we can acknowledge progress while also discussing what we might be losing. But you won't even allow that conversation because that conversation is often used to undermine the progress itself. Kelly countered. It's the same tactic every time. Acknowledge that maybe some things got better, but focus on the supposed downsides. It's a way of maintaining the status quo while appearing reasonable. Douglas's eyes flashed with renewed frustration. Or maybe it's just honest observation. Maybe it's noticing that fear has become the dominant emotion in Hollywood. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of casting the wrong actor. Fear of telling the wrong story. And fear doesn't produce great art, Kelly. It produces safe, sanitized content that offends no one and moves no one. Kelly stepped toward him again, her voice rising. You keep talking about fear, but you know what? Maybe some of that fear is good. Maybe people should be afraid of perpetuating harm. Maybe they should think twice before making choices that marginalize or stereotype people. That's not censorship, Michael. That's basic consideration. At what cost? Douglas asked, matching her intensity. At the cost of honest storytelling? At the cost of complex characters who don't fit neat moral categories? At the cost of art that actually reflects the messy reality of human existence? Kelly's voice was sharp as glass. Those are excuses. They're always excuses. People said the same things when they were asked to stop using racial slurs. When they were asked to include women in meaningful roles. When they were asked to represent LGBTQ people as actual human beings instead of punchlines. And every single time the art got better, not worse. Douglas's face darkened. Don't you dare compare me to those people. Don't you dare suggest that having concerns about creative freedom is the same as defending bigotry. Then stop sounding like them, Kelly shot back. Stop using the same arguments they used. Stop pretending that being asked to think about others is some terrible burden. The security guards shifted uncomfortably. One of them spoke again, more firmly this time. Mr. Douglas, we really need to go now. Douglas ignored them, his focus entirely on Kelly. You want to know what I really think? I think you're scared, too. I think you're so afraid of being on the wrong side of these issues that you've stopped thinking for yourself. You've adopted every approved position, every sanctioned belief because it's safe. Because it means you'll never be criticized, never be challenged, never have to actually defend your ideas. Kelly's eyes blazed. How dare you? You don't know anything about me, about what I believe, or why I believe it. You're just angry that someone is finally standing up to you, finally telling you that your views aren't universal truth. Douglas's voice dropped to something almost menacing. I'm angry that we can't even have this conversation without you calling security. That tells me everything I need to know about your commitment to dialogue, to understanding different perspectives. You talk about inclusion, but you only include people who already agree with you. Kelly's hand shot up, pointing at him. No, you don't get to flip this around. You came on my show and used it as a platform to complain about progress to diminish the real struggles of real people. And when I pushed back, when I refused to let that go unchallenged, you acted like you were being persecuted. That's not me shutting down dialogue. That's me refusing to enable yours. Douglas looked at the security guards, then back at Kelly one final time. You know what the real tragedy is? In 10 years, maybe 20, people will look back at this moment and see it differently than you do right now. They'll see the intolerance, the rigidity, the refusal to engage with anything outside a narrow worldview. And they'll wonder how we got here. Kelly's voice was ice. Get him out of here now. The security guards finally moved with purpose, each taking one of Douglas's arms. He didn't resist, but he kept his eyes on Kelly. This isn't over. This conversation, this debate, it's happening everywhere. And shutting people down isn't going to stop it. Kelly stood tall, her voice unwavering. I'm not trying to shut down a conversation. I'm choosing not to participate in one that dismisses people's humanity. There's a difference. As the guards began to lead Douglas toward the wings, he called back over his shoulder. Keep telling yourself that, Kelly. Keep believing you're one of the good ones. Maybe it'll help you sleep at night. Kelly watched him go, her chest heaving, her hands still trembling. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud, to boo, or to simply process what they just witnessed. Kelly turned to face them,